The gavel fell like a death sentence in the packed Morrison County livestock auction barn. Thunder, though nobody had called him by that name in 15 years, lay sprawled in the sawdust ring, his massive Brahmin frame broken not by age, but by the cruelty of men who saw dollar signs where God had put a soul. "Lot 47, the auctioneer's voice cracked like old leather. "Brahmin bull, approximately 1/800 pounds of... Well, folks, I'll be honest with you. This one's seen better days." The crowd stirred restlessly. Someone in the back hollered, "That beast ain't worth the dirt he's lying on." Harsh laughter rippled through the barn like a cold wind. But then Thunder's massive head lifted, just slightly, and his dark eyes found a face in the crowd. Jake Morrison felt his breath catch. Those eyes. There was something in those eyes that made his chest tight. "Going once," the auctioneer called desperately. Jake's hand shot up. What he didn't know was that he wasn't saving a stranger. He was bringing home a ghost from his own past. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 5 years had passed since that fateful night when the community stood together in Jake Morrison's driveway, and the transformation of both man and bull had become the stuff of local legend. The Morrison Ranch now sprawled across 500 acres, purchased with the profits from Jake's innovative agritourism business that drew visitors from across the country to witness the miracle of Thunder's story. Jake stood on the wraparound porch of the new house he'd built for his growing family, watching his 4-year-old son Tommy ride on Thunder's broad back, while his 2-year-old daughter Sarah clapped her hands from the safety of the paddock fence. The massive Brahmin bull, now a gentle giant with silver threading through his coat, moved with the careful precision of a creature who understood the precious cargo he carried. "Easy does it, Thunder," Jake called out, though he knew the bull needed no reminding. In all the years since his return, Thunder had never shown a moment's aggression, becoming instead the ranch's unofficial babysitter and the children's most devoted guardian. Vicky emerged from the barn, her veterinary bag in one hand and a satisfied smile on her face. "The new calf is doing beautifully," she announced, settling beside Jake on the porch swing they'd installed 2 summers ago. "Thunder's bloodline is strong. We've got 5 healthy calves this season alone." The irony wasn't lost on Jake that the bull once deemed worthless had become the foundation of their breeding program, his gentle temperament and superior genetics making him one of the most sought-after sires in the region. But more than that, Thunder had become a symbol of hope for the entire community, proof that second chances weren't just possible, they were miraculous. "Daddy, look!" Tommy called out, his small hands gripping Thunder's harness as the bull carefully stepped over a fallen log. "Thunder's teaching me to be brave." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion, remembering his own childhood fears and how his father had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Now Thunder was passing on that same lesson to a new generation, showing them that strength and gentleness could coexist in the same heart. As the sun began to set over the ranch that had once teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Sometimes the most profound victories came disguised as the most devastating defeats, and sometimes the very thing that seemed destined to break you was actually meant to make you whole. Thunder's legacy would live on in the children he protected, the community he'd united, and the countless visitors who left the ranch with renewed faith in the transformative power of love. He had taught them all that home wasn't just a place. It was a choice to love unconditionally, to forgive completely, and to believe in second chances even when the world had given up hope. Jake Morrison had always been an early riser, but lately sleep had become as elusive as morning mist. At 28, he carried the weight of 4 generations on his shoulders, and some mornings it felt like that weight might crush him into the Texas dirt his great-grandfather had claimed with nothing but determination and a handful of hope. The kitchen of the Morrison ranch house still smelled like his father's coffee and his mother's biscuits, even though both had been gone for years now. His mother, Sarah, had lost her battle with cancer when Jake was 16, and 6 months ago, his father Samuel had been killed in a farming accident that still haunted Jake's dreams. Now Jake sat alone at the same scarred wooden table where 4 generations of Morrison men had made their hardest decisions, staring at a foreclosure notice that might as well have been his family's death certificate. 30 days. The bank had given him 30 days to come up with $50,000, money he didn't have, couldn't borrow, and had no earthly idea how to earn. The medical bills from his mother's treatment had eaten through their savings like locusts through a wheat field, and his father's accident had brought more bills, more debt, and more sleepless nights than Jake could count. "Morning, son," he whispered to the empty kitchen, a habit he'd developed since his father's death. "I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying to save what you built, but I don't know if I'm strong enough." The silence that answered him was deafening. Outside, the land stretched for 200 acres in every direction. Good land, fertile land, the kind of land that had made the Morrison family name synonymous with integrity and hard work in Morrison County. But integrity didn't pay banknotes, and hard work didn't mean much when you were working alone. Jake's reflection stared back at him from the black coffee, showing his father's eyes, his grandfather's stubborn jaw, and his great-grandfather's hands that had never known the meaning of quit. But right now, those hands were shaking as he reached for the foreclosure notice, reading it for the 100th time as if the words might somehow change. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. Eleanor Henderson's voice crackled through the receiver, warm as summer sunshine despite the early hour. At 72, Ellie had been the Morrison family's neighbor for 40 years, had helped deliver Jake when the doctor couldn't make it through a spring storm, and had become the closest thing to a grandmother Jake had ever known. "Jake, honey, you eating?" Her voice carried the kind of concern that came from watching a boy grow into a man and recognizing when that man was drowning. "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Henderson." The lie came as naturally as breathing. He'd been living on grief and black coffee for weeks, his appetite as dead as his hopes. "Don't you ma'am me, child. I've been Ellie to you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper and ornery as a wet cat." Her laugh was like music, the kind that reminded Jake there was still joy in the world, even when he couldn't find it. "Bobby Ray's picking me up for the livestock auction this morning. Why don't you come along? Might do you good to get out of that house before it starts feeling like a tomb." Jake started to decline. The last thing he needed was to be reminded of the cattle business he could no longer afford to be in. But something in Ellie's tone stopped him. The same tone she'd used when she'd talked him through his mother's death, when she'd held him while he cried at his father's funeral, when she'd brought casseroles he was too heartbroken to eat. "I don't have money for cattle, Ellie." Who said anything about buying? Sometimes a man just needs to remember he's part of something bigger than his troubles. Besides, you've been holed up in that house like a hermit for weeks. Your daddy wouldn't want you living like that. An hour later, Jake found himself squeezed into Bobby Ray Martinez's pickup truck, bouncing down the dusty road toward town. Bobby Ray had been his best friend since they were 12 years old, the kind of friend who'd help you move a body and never ask questions. They'd played football together at Morrison County High, had chased the same girls, had shared their dreams of taking over their families' ranches and living the good life that their fathers had built. But life had a way of kicking dreams in the teeth. Bobby Ray still had his ranch, still had his cattle, still had his future mapped out in neat, manageable parcels. Jake had bills, debt, and 30 days to figure out how to save everything his family had worked for. "You look like hell warmed over," Bobby Ray observed, chewing on a toothpick that had been his trademark since high school. "When's the last time you slept?" "Sleep's overrated. So's dying young, but here you are, working on both." Bobby Ray's voice carried the kind of concern that came from 2 decades of friendship. Talk to me, brother. What's eating at you? Jake stared out the window at the rolling hills that had been his playground as a child, his workplace as a teenager, and now his burden as a man. Banks foreclosing. 30 days. Jesus, Jake, why didn't you tell me? What were you going to do? You've got your own problems. My problems don't include losing the family ranch. Bobby Ray was quiet for a moment. The only sound, the rumble of the truck's engine and the whisper of wind through the open windows. How much do you need? 50,000. Bobby Ray whistled low. That's a lot of money, brother. Too much. I've been over the books 100 times, looked at every option. There's no way. Jake's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. Morrison men didn't cry, didn't show weakness, didn't give up. But then again, Morrison men had never faced what Jake was facing. From the passenger seat, Ellie reached back and patted Jake's knee with a hand that had comforted 3 generations of Morrison men. Your daddy went through hard times too, you know. Lost the whole wheat crop in '98, had to sell half the herd just to keep the lights on, but he never gave up. Said the Lord don't give you more than you can handle, even when it feels like he's testing your faith with a sledgehammer. Dad had help. He had you, had the community, had people who cared. Jake's voice was bitter, tasting like dust and disappointment. People cross the street now when they see me coming, like failure might be contagious. People are scared, honey. Scared of catching whatever bad luck's following you around like a storm cloud. But bad luck's like weather. It passes if you wait it out and keep your head up. What if I don't have time to wait it out? Ellie turned in her seat to look at him directly, her eyes holding the wisdom of 7 decades of living. Then you do what Morrison men have always done. You find a way, or you make one. The Morrison County Livestock Auction sat on the edge of town like a weathered cathedral, its tin roof gleaming in the morning sun, and its weathered boards telling stories of 1,000 deals, 1,000 dreams, and 1,000 heartbreaks. The parking lot was full of pickup trucks, horse trailers, and the kind of men who measured their worth in head of cattle and acres under cultivation. Jake felt their eyes on him as he walked toward the barn, heard the whispers that followed him like shadows. In a small town, everybody knew everybody else's business, and Jake's business had become the kind of cautionary tale that fathers told their sons about the dangers of getting too big for your britches. That's the Morrison boy. Shame about his daddy. Heard the bank's fixing to take the ranch. Always figured it would happen eventually. Should have sold out years ago when land prices were good. Now he's got nothing but debt and regret. Jake's hands clenched into fists, but Ellie's gentle touch on his arm kept him walking straight. Inside the barn, the familiar smell of hay and livestock mixed with something else, the sharp scent of desperation that clung to auctions like smoke to clothes. They found seats in the back, Jake grateful for the shadows that hid his face from the neighbors who'd known him since he was a boy. The auction moved with the rhythm of commerce, cattle coming and going, prices called out like prayers in a foreign language. Jake watched the successful bidders, men with deep pockets and deeper confidence, and felt the familiar weight of his own failures pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. He was lost in his own misery when they brought out the bull that would change everything. The massive Brahmin bull had to be helped into the ring, his legs shaking with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. Jake had seen broken animals before. Hell, he'd been one for months. But something about this bull's defeat cut straight to his soul like a blade finding bone. The crowd's reaction was immediate and merciless, the kind of cruelty that small towns could dish out when they smelled weakness. "Look at that sorry excuse for a bull," someone shouted from the front row. "Probably mean as a rattlesnake and twice as useless." "Put that poor creature out of its misery," another voice called out, followed by harsh laughter that echoed off the barn's tin roof like hail on a coffin lid. But Jake saw something else in those dark eyes that made his breath catch in his throat. He saw his own reflection, his own brokenness, his own desperate need for someone to believe he was worth saving. The bull's massive head hung low, his scarred hide telling stories of rope burns and electric prods, of men who took and took until there was nothing left to take. "What's wrong with him?" Jake whispered to Bobby Ray, his voice barely audible over the crowd's jeers. "Clarence Williams brought him in. Big C don't deal in healthy stock. Too expensive. This one's probably been rode hard and put up wet more times than you can count." Bobby Ray's voice carried the disgust that every decent rancher felt for men like Clarence Williams. Clarence Big C Williams was the kind of man who gave livestock dealers a bad name. He'd buy animals cheap from desperate farmers, work them until they broke, then sell them for whatever he could get. Jake had heard stories about Big C's operation that would make a grown man weep, stories of animals kept in conditions that would shame the devil himself. The auctioneer, a man named Pete Sullivan, who'd been calling livestock sales for 30 years, cleared his throat and tried to drum up interest. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a purebred Brahman bull here, approximately 1,800 pounds of—" He paused, searching for something positive to say about the broken animal in his ring. "Well, he's got good bone structure." The crowd wasn't buying it. Jake could see in their faces the same look he'd been getting from his neighbors for months. The look that said some things were too broken to fix, some fights too lost to win, some dreams too shattered to rebuild. "Nobody wants that bull," Ellie said quietly, her voice carrying the sadness of someone who'd seen too much suffering in her 72 years. "He's too big, too old, too broken. They'll probably sell him for dog food if they can sell him at all." Something twisted in Jake's stomach like barbed wire. He watched the bull's massive head hang in defeat, watched the way his scarred hide told silent stories of cruelty, watched the complete absence of hope in every line of his body. This wasn't just an animal. This was a warrior who'd been beaten down by life until he'd forgotten how to fight, forgotten what it felt like to be loved, forgotten that he had any value beyond the price per pound of his flesh. "Going once!" Pete Sullivan called out, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "This is a registered Brahman bull, folks. Surely someone sees value here." The barn was already losing interest, conversations turning to the next lot, to better prospects, to animals that hadn't given up on life. Jake felt tears burning his eyes, felt the familiar rage that had been eating at him since his father's death. Here was another victim of men who took and took until there was nothing left to take, another casualty of a world that measured worth in dollars and cents instead of dignity and dreams. His hand shot up before his brain could stop it. "I'll take him." The barn went silent as a tomb. 2,000 eyes turned toward Jake, and he felt naked under their stare, exposed and vulnerable and completely out of his depth. But something in the bull's eyes, a flicker of awareness, a spark of something that might have been hope, kept him standing. Bobby Ray grabbed his arm with fingers that felt like steel cables. "Brother, what are you doing? You don't have money for groceries, much less a bull that size." "I've got $500, Jake said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "It's all I have left in the world, but it's enough." The auctioneer looked stunned, his gavel frozen halfway to the block. "We have a bid of $500. "Do I hear—" "Wait, just a damn minute!" The voice boomed across the barn like thunder, and every head turned toward the source. Clarence Williams stood up in the front row, his massive frame blocking the light like a mountain of malice. At 58, Big C was a man built like a bulldozer, with the temperament to match and the scruples of a snake oil salesman. "That bull's got problems, boy," Big C called out, his voice carrying the false concern of a predator sizing up prey. "He's hurt people before. 3 men in the hospital, property damage, the works. You sure you want that kind of liability hanging around your neck? Jake felt the eyes of the crowd on him, heard the whispers starting up again, felt the familiar weight of other people's expectations pressing down on his shoulders. But when he looked at the bull, he saw something that made his decision easy. The animal had lifted his massive head and was looking directly at Jake with eyes that held intelligence, pain, and something else. Recognition. Not the recognition of sight, but the deeper recognition of one broken thing finding another, of two souls who understood what it meant to be written off, given up on, left for dead. "I'm sure," Jake said, his voice carrying across the barn with the authority of a man who'd finally found his purpose. "Your funeral, kid," Big C said with a laugh that sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. "Literally." Pete Sullivan looked around the barn one more time, his gavel poised like a judge's hammer. "Going once, going twice." The gavel fell with the finality of destiny. "Sold to the young man in the back." As Jake walked down the aisle to complete his purchase, he heard the whispers following him like a funeral dirge. Some were curious, others skeptical, but all were watching to see what would happen when the crazy Morrison boy got up close to the most dangerous bull in 3 counties. But when Jake reached the ring, something miraculous happened. The bull, who had kept his head down throughout the entire ordeal, slowly lifted his massive head and looked directly at Jake. And in those dark eyes, Jake saw something that had been missing from his own life for months: hope. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, climbing over the rail with the kind of reckless courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. "I know you're scared. I know they hurt you, but that's over now. You're coming home with me." The bull's ears twitched forward, and Jake could swear he saw understanding in those ancient eyes. The crowd held its breath, waiting for violence, for the moment when the dangerous animal would show his true nature. But instead, the bull took a careful step toward Jake, his massive head lowering until they were eye to eye. Jake reached out slowly, his hand trembling as it approached the bull's scarred forehead. The animal's skin was warm, marked with old wounds and fresher hurts, but alive with intelligence and a desperate need for kindness. When Jake's fingers made contact, the bull's eyes closed, and a soft exhale escaped his nostrils, the first sign of peace he'd shown in years. "I'll be damned," someone whispered from the crowd. "Look at that." "What's he doing to that bull?" another voice asked, wonder replacing the earlier cruelty. Jake felt the connection forming between them, felt the trust beginning to build like a bridge across the gulf of pain that separated them. This wasn't just about rescuing an animal. This was about two broken things finding each other and choosing to believe that healing was possible. "We're going to be all right," Jake said, not sure if he was talking to the bull or himself. "We're both going to be all right." The bull's response was to lean into Jake's touch, his massive frame relaxing for the first time in years. And in that moment, Jake understood that he hadn't just bought a bull. He'd found a kindred spirit, a fellow survivor, a reason to keep fighting when everything else seemed lost. The paperwork took 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Jake signed his name with hands that shook from excitement rather than fear, paid his $500 with money he couldn't afford to spend, and officially became the owner of the most dangerous bull in Morrison County. Except Jake didn't think he was dangerous at all. He thought he was just tired, just hurt, just waiting for someone to see past the scars to the soul beneath. And Jake Morrison, who knew something about being broken, was exactly the right person to see it. Loading Thunder into Bobby Ray's livestock trailer was like trying to convince a mountain to move, but the bull seemed to understand that Jake was different from the men who'd hurt him. He climbed in slowly, his massive hooves careful on the metal ramp, and stood quietly during the drive back to the Morrison ranch. Jake rode in the back of the truck, watching through the trailer's slats as Thunder's intelligent eyes took in the passing countryside, and he could swear he saw something like anticipation in that ancient gaze. "You've lost your damn mind," Bobby Ray said for the third time, but there was admiration in his voice that he couldn't quite hide. "That bull could kill you in your sleep, and here you are treating him like a pet." "He won't hurt me," Jake said with certainty he didn't fully understand. "He's not a killer, Bobby Ray. He's just tired." Tired of being hurt, tired of being afraid, tired of being alone. Sounds like someone else I know, Ellie observed from the passenger seat, her wise eyes finding Jake's in the rearview mirror. "Sometimes the Lord puts broken things in our path, not so we can fix them, but so they can fix us." When they reached the ranch, Jake led Thunder to the old paddock behind the barn, the same one where his father had kept the breeding stock 20 years ago. The bull walked slowly, his massive head swinging from side to side as he took in his new surroundings. But when they reached the gate, something strange happened. Thunder stopped dead in his tracks and looked around with what Jake could only describe as recognition. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Jake asked softly, studying the bull's reaction. "This place means something to you." Thunder's massive head turned toward the far corner of the paddock, and without hesitation, he walked directly to that spot, the exact location where Jake's father used to keep his prize bull decades ago. The coincidence sent chills down Jake's spine, but he pushed the feeling aside. Coincidences were for people who had time to wonder about mysteries. Jake had a bull to heal and a ranch to save. That first night, Jake sat on the porch with a beer that had gone warm in his hands, watching Thunder graze in the moonlight. The bull stayed close to the fence, as if seeking comfort in Jake's presence. Every few minutes, those intelligent eyes would look toward the house, and Jake felt a connection he couldn't explain, like looking into a mirror that reflected not his face, but his soul. "What happened to you, big guy?" Jake asked the darkness. "Who hurt you so bad that you forgot how to trust?" As if in answer, Thunder raised his massive head and looked directly at Jake. And in that moment, Jake could have sworn he heard his father's voice on the wind, the same voice that had taught him about patience, about second chances, about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. "Some things are worth saving, son," the memory whispered, "even when they seem too broken to fix." The next morning brought Jake's first real test. He woke to the sound of Thunder's distressed bellowing, a sound that vibrated through the ground and sent birds fleeing from the trees. Jake ran to the paddock to find the bull pressed against the fence, his massive frame trembling with what looked like pure terror. It took Jake several minutes to realize what was wrong. The neighbor's dog was barking, and the sound was sending Thunder into a panic. "Easy, boy," Jake called out, climbing over the fence with the kind of reckless courage that comes from desperation. "It's just Buster. He's all bark and no bite, I promise." But Thunder was lost in some private hell, his eyes wild with memories of pain and fear. Jake could see the scars on the bull's hide more clearly now, rope burns around his massive neck, marks from electric prods on his flanks, and the hollow look of an animal who'd learned that humans meant suffering. "I know you're scared," Jake said, approaching slowly with his hands visible and his voice steady. "I know they hurt you, but you're safe now. I promise you're safe." It took 20 minutes to calm Thunder down, and by the end of it, both man and bull were exhausted. Jake leaned against the fence, watching Thunder's sides heave with the effort of breathing, and felt a rage so pure it made his hands shake. Whatever had been done to this magnificent creature, it had left scars that went deeper than flesh. That afternoon, Jake drove into town to buy feed and supplies, his last $500 now reduced to whatever loose change he could find in his truck's ashtray. The feed store was full of the usual suspects, ranchers and farmers who'd known Jake since he was a boy. But now their conversations stopped when he walked in, and he could feel their judgment like a physical weight. "Heard you bought Big C's problem bull," said Tom Fletcher, a man who'd been friends with Jake's father for 30 years. "That animal's dangerous, Jake. Hurt 3 men over at the Williams place. You sure you know what you're doing?" I'm sure, Jake replied, loading 50-pound bags of feed into his cart with movements that were more aggressive than necessary. Your daddy was a good man, Tom continued, his voice carrying the kind of pity that made Jake's jaw clench. He wouldn't want you taking risks like this.
Not when you're all alone out there. Jake paid for his supplies and loaded them into his truck without responding. What could he say? That he'd bought the bull because he recognized something in those broken eyes, that he felt a connection he couldn't explain, that saving Thunder felt like the first right thing he'd done since his father died. When he got home, he found Dr. Victoria Harlan's veterinary truck in his driveway. At 31, Vicky was the best large animal vet in 3 counties, and the only woman Jake had ever met who could deliver a calf and look beautiful doing it. She was leaning against the paddock fence, watching Thunder with the kind of professional interest that made Jake's heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with veterinary medicine. "Heard you made an interesting purchase," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the warm honey of a woman who'd been born and raised in Texas. News travels fast in a small town. Jake, I examined this bull about 6 months ago over at William's place. He's been through hell, malnutrition, dehydration, probable abuse. What made you buy him? Jake joined her at the fence, close enough to smell her perfume mixed with the honest scent of hay and antiseptic. He needed someone to believe in him. And you think you're that someone? I think we all deserve a second chance. Vicky was quiet for a long moment, studying Thunder with the kind of attention that made Jake wish she'd look at him the same way. You know, my grandfather used to say that sometimes God puts broken things in our path, not so we can fix them, but so they can fix us. Your grandfather was a wise man. He was. He also said that the most dangerous animals are the ones that have given up hope. But this bull... She gestured toward Thunder, who was grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. Look at him, Jake. He hasn't given up. He's just been waiting. Waiting for what? For someone to see him the way you do. That evening, Jake sat in his father's old chair on the porch, watching Thunder in the fading light. The bull had settled into a routine, grazing during the day, drinking from the old stone trough his great-grandfather had carved by hand, and always positioning himself where he could see the house. It was like he was standing guard, protecting the man who'd saved him from a fate worse than death. Bobby Ray pulled up in his truck, carrying a bag from the diner in town, and the kind of expression that said he had something on his mind. Figured you were too stubborn to come to dinner, so I brought dinner to you. They ate in the comfortable silence that comes from 20 years of friendship, the kind of silence that didn't need words to fill it. Finally, Bobby Ray spoke the words that Jake had been dreading. People are talking, Jake. People always talk. They're saying you've lost your mind, that grief's made you reckless, that you're putting everyone at risk with that bull. Jake looked at his friend, seeing the worry in his eyes, the genuine concern that came from caring about someone who might be making the biggest mistake of his life. Maybe they're right. Maybe I have lost my mind. But for the first time in months, I don't feel like I'm drowning. That bull's not going to save your ranch, brother. I know that. Then what's this about? Jake was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that could explain the unexplainable. When I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8, Dad had this old dog, blue heeler mix, half wild, meaner than sin. Someone had beaten him bad before he showed up here, and he didn't trust anyone. Mom said he was too dangerous to keep, but Dad wouldn't give up on him. What happened to him? Took 2 years, but eventually he learned to trust. Became the best damn cattle dog we ever had, saved Dad's life more than once when a bull got ornery. Jake looked toward Thunder, who was standing at the fence as if listening to every word. That dog taught me something important about broken things. Sometimes they're not really broken. They're just waiting for the right person to see past the scars. And you think that bull's waiting for you?
I think we're waiting for each other. Bobby Ray finished his beer and stood up, his expression thoughtful. Well, brother, I hope you're right. Because if you're wrong, it's going to be a damn short wait. After Bobby Ray left, Jake walked out to the paddock. Thunder was waiting at the fence, his massive head lowered to Jake's level, those intelligent eyes holding something that looked like gratitude. Jake reached out and touched the bull's forehead, feeling the warmth of living flesh, the steady pulse of a heart that hadn't given up.
I don't know what they did to you, Jake said softly, his voice carrying across the quiet night. But I know what they did to me. They took everything that mattered and left me with nothing but bills and regret. But maybe that's not the end of the story. Maybe this is just the beginning. Thunder's response was to lean into Jake's touch, his massive frame relaxing in a way that spoke of trust being slowly rebuilt. They stood there in the moonlight, man and bull, both of them healing, both of them hoping, both of them learning that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with fists or weapons, but with patience, kindness, and the simple act of refusing to give up on something worth saving. 2 weeks after bringing Thunder home, Jake discovered something that would change everything he thought he knew about fate, destiny, and the mysterious ways that broken things find their way back where they belong. He was cleaning out his father's old desk, searching for insurance papers and financial records, when his fingers found a leather-bound ledger hidden in the back of the bottom drawer. Samuel Morrison had been meticulous about record-keeping, documenting every animal that had come through the ranch for the past 40 years. Jake flipped through the pages with growing fascination, seeing familiar names and bloodlines, reading his father's careful handwriting as it chronicled the rise and fall of the Morrison Ranch's fortunes. Then he reached an entry that made his blood run cold and his hands shake like autumn leaves. Thunder, Brahman bull calf, born April 15, 1992. Sired by tornado, out of lightning. Sold to Williams Livestock, October 1995. Age 3 years. Note: hardest decision I ever made. Had to choose between keeping the bull or keeping the ranch. Chose the ranch. Hope whoever gets him treats him right. Jake read the entry 3 times before the words penetrated his consciousness. Thunder. The bull he'd bought at auction wasn't just any broken animal. He was coming home. This was the same bull that had been born on the Morrison Ranch 30 years ago, raised by Jake's father, and sold during one of the family's darkest financial hours when medical bills from his mother's cancer treatment had threatened to destroy everything they'd built. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered, his voice echoing in the empty kitchen. No wonder you knew this place. No wonder you went straight to that corner of the paddock. The memories came flooding back then, triggered by the knowledge of who Thunder really was. Jake had been 8 years old when Thunder was born, and he'd been there for the birth, watching his father help the massive calf into the world on a cold spring morning. He remembered Thunder as a young bull, full of energy and curiosity, following Jake around the ranch like a 2,000-pound puppy. He remembered the day Thunder had been loaded into the trailer, remembered his father's face, the same expression of barely controlled grief that Jake had seen in his own mirror every morning for the past 6 months, the look of a man who'd been forced to sacrifice something precious to survive, who'd made the hardest choice a rancher could make and would carry the weight of it for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jake said to the empty room, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't remember. I'm sorry I couldn't save the ranch then, and I'm sorry I can't save it now." But even as he spoke the words, Jake felt something shifting in his chest, not the familiar weight of failure, but something lighter, something that felt almost like hope. Thunder's return wasn't an accident or a coincidence. It was meant to be. The bull had been gone for 27 years, but somehow, in the darkest hour of the Morrison family's history, he'd found his way home. Jake walked out to the paddock with new eyes, seeing Thunder not as a broken animal he'd rescued, but as a piece of his family's history, a living connection to his father's legacy. The bull was waiting at the fence, and when Jake approached, Thunder's massive head came up, ears forward, eyes bright with the kind of intelligence that spoke of recognition deeper than sight. "I know who you are now," Jake said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I know why you came back."
"You're not just any bull. You're family." Thunder stepped closer to the fence, and Jake could swear he saw something like understanding in those dark eyes. This wasn't just about a man rescuing a bull, or even about two broken things finding each other. This was about completion, about a circle that had been broken 27 years ago, finally being made whole again. "We're going to figure this out," Jake promised, reaching through the fence to touch Thunder's scarred forehead. "I don't know how, but we're going to save this place. Together, the way it should have been all along." That evening, Jake called Ellie Henderson and asked her to come over. She arrived within the hour, carrying a casserole that smelled like heaven and wearing the kind of knowing smile that said she'd been expecting this call for weeks.
"You figured it out,"
she said, settling into the kitchen chair across from Jake with the grace of a woman who'd spent 72 years learning how to be exactly where she was needed most.
You knew. You knew all along, didn't you?"
Ellie's smile was sad and knowing, holding the weight of decades of friendship with the Morrison family.
"I was there the day your daddy sold him, Jake."
Breaking that man's heart was one of the hardest things I ever witnessed. But he didn't have a choice. Your mama's medical bills had piled up like storm clouds, and the bank was breathing down his neck like a wolf at the door.
"Why didn't you tell me?"
"Because you needed to find your own way to Thunder. Your daddy made me promise that if that bull ever came back, I'd let nature take its course. If Jake's meant to have him," he said, "he'll know without being told."
And you did know, didn't you? "The moment you saw him at that auction."
Jake nodded, remembering the inexplicable pull he'd felt when Thunder's eyes had found his across the crowded barn.
"I knew something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was like looking at a ghost."
"That's because love recognizes love, even when memory fails. That bull never forgot this place, never forgot your family. He's been waiting 27 years to come home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Thunder through the kitchen window. The bull was grazing peacefully, but every few minutes, he'd look toward the house with the kind of attention that spoke of devotion deeper than instinct.
"He's been waiting for you," Ellie said softly. "All these years, through all the pain and abuse, he's been waiting to come home. And now he has. But I'm still going to lose the ranch, Ellie. Having Thunder back doesn't change the fact that I owe $50,000 I don't have. Maybe not. But having him back changes you. And sometimes that's all the miracle we need."
Ellie reached across the table and patted Jake's hand with fingers that had comforted 3 generations of Morrison men. "Your daddy used to say that the Lord works in mysterious ways, but sometimes he ain't mysterious at all. Sometimes he just sends exactly what we need, exactly when we need it." The next morning brought visitors that Jake wasn't expecting. He was working in the barn when he heard trucks pulling into the driveway, not the friendly rumble of neighbors dropping by, but the aggressive roar of engines that meant business. Jake looked out to see a convoy of vehicles, Big C. Williams' black pickup leading the way, followed by a large livestock trailer, Deputy Carl Morrison's patrol car, and 2 more trucks filled with men Jake didn't recognize. Jake's stomach dropped like a stone in deep water. This couldn't be good.
Big C climbed out of his truck like a man with a mission, his massive frame casting a shadow across the yard that seemed to swallow the morning light. Deputy Morrison emerged from the patrol car, his face carrying the kind of apologetic expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Behind them came 4 men who looked like they'd been hired more for their size than their intelligence, each carrying equipment that made Jake's blood run cold.
"Morning, Jake," Big C called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Good day for settling old business." "What kind of business?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be anything he wanted to hear.
"About that bull you bought." See, I've been doing some thinking about that sale, and I realized I made a mistake. A big mistake. Big C pulled out a folded paper from his shirt pocket with the flourish of a magician revealing a trick. That animal's dangerous, son. He's hurt people before, and he's going to hurt people again. I can't have that on my conscience. Jake felt Thunder's presence before he saw him. The bull had moved to the fence, separating the paddock from the yard, his massive head raised, ears forward, watching the confrontation with the kind of intelligent attention that spoke of understanding exactly what was happening. The sale was legal, Jake said, fighting to keep his voice steady. I paid my money, you got paid, the deal's done. That's where you're wrong, boy. Big C unfolded the paper with theatrical precision. Turns out that bull was reported as a dangerous animal 6 months ago. State law says I can't sell dangerous livestock without proper disclosure. Since I didn't disclose that little fact, the sale's null and void. Deputy Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that Jake recognized as both apologetic and final. I'm sorry, Jake, but we have a court order. The bull has to be returned to Mr. Williams for proper evaluation and potential disposal. Disposal? Jake's voice cracked like a whip. You mean you're going to kill him? Now, son, that's not necessarily true, Big C said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But that animal's a public safety hazard. He's already put 3 men in the hospital, caused thousands of dollars in property damage. We can't take the risk of him hurting someone else. Those men were drunk, Jake said, his voice rising with anger and desperation. They were trying to ride him like a rodeo bull. Any animal would have defended itself. That's your opinion, boy, but the law's the law, and the law says dangerous animals got to be dealt with properly. Thunder had moved closer to the fence, his massive body tense with awareness. Jake could see the intelligence in those dark eyes, could see that Thunder understood exactly what was happening. The bull who'd survived 27 years of abuse, who'd endured more pain than any living creature should have to bear, was about to be taken back to the hell he'd escaped from. I won't let you take him, Jake said, moving toward the paddock with the kind of desperate courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. Jake, don't make this harder than it has to be, Deputy Morrison said, his voice carrying genuine regret. The law's the law, and I got to enforce it. The law's whatever Big C wants it to be, apparently. Big C's false smile slipped, revealing the cruel satisfaction underneath. Boy, you're walking a dangerous line. That bull's going to hurt someone, and when he does, their blood's going to be on your hands. Is that what you want? Can you live with that? Jake looked at Thunder, seeing the trust in those ancient eyes, seeing the hope that had been building over the past 2 weeks. He thought about his father, about the promises he'd made, about the ledger entry that proved Thunder belonged here, belonged to the Morrison family, belonged home. He's not dangerous, Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. He's home, and he's staying home. Home? Big C laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Son, that bull don't know the meaning of home. He's a wild animal, nothing more. A dangerous wild animal that's about to be put down for the safety of the community. You're wrong. Jake climbed over the fence into the paddock, his movements slow and deliberate. Thunder moved toward him immediately, his massive head lowering to Jake's level in a gesture of trust so profound it made several of the watching men step back instinctively. Jake reached out and touched Thunder's forehead, feeling the warmth of living flesh, the steady pulse of a heart that had never forgotten love. Thunder's eyes closed, and a soft rumble came from deep in his chest. Not anger or aggression, but the sound of contentment, of peace, of coming home. I'll be damned, Deputy Morrison whispered, his hand moving away from his gun. But Big C wasn't impressed. Pretty trick, but it don't change the facts. That bull's a killer, and sooner or later he's going to show his true colors.
Better to put him down now before he hurts someone innocent. The only one here who's hurt innocent creatures is you, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of Morrison integrity. You take animals and break them, then throw them away when they're used up. But Thunder's not broken anymore. He's home, and he's staying home. We'll see about that. Big C nodded to his men, and they began moving toward the paddock with ropes and electric prods. Boys, load him up. Time to go home. But home, Jake realized, was exactly where they were standing. And he'd be damned if he was going to let anyone take Thunder away from the place where he belonged. The next hour unfolded like a nightmare that Jake couldn't wake up from. Despite his protests, despite Thunder's calm behavior, despite every instinct screaming that this was wrong, the legal machinery ground forward with the merciless efficiency of a combine harvester cutting through wheat. Deputy Morrison served the papers with apologetic hands. Big C's men positioned themselves around the paddock with the practiced ease of predators, and Jake found himself holding court documents that might as well have been Thunder's death warrant. You have 24 hours to comply with this order, Deputy Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in law enforcement and the regret of a man who'd seen too much injustice dressed up as justice. If you don't surrender the animal voluntarily, we'll be back with additional officers to remove him by force. Jake read the papers with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. The legal language was dense and impenetrable, but the meaning was crystal clear. Thunder was to be returned to Clarence Williams for proper evaluation and potential disposal. The words blurred together as Jake's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to shed in front of these men. This is murder, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're going to murder him, and you're hiding behind the law to do it. That's a serious accusation, boy, Big C said, but his eyes held the satisfaction of a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. I'm just following proper procedures for dangerous animals. Can't have him hurting anyone else. He's never hurt anyone! Jake's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. Those men you keep talking about were drunk idiots trying to ride a bull. Any animal would have defended itself. That's your opinion, but the state veterinarian's report says different. Jake felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. What veterinarian? When was he examined? Big C's smile was cold as a February morning. 6 months ago. Dr. Patricia Hendricks from the state office. She declared him a public safety hazard based on his aggressive behavior and history of violence. I want to see that report. It's confidential, but I can tell you it recommends immediate euthanasia for the safety of the community. Jake looked at Thunder, who was standing quietly beside him, massive head lowered, eyes holding the kind of resigned sadness that spoke of a creature who'd learned not to hope for better treatment from humans. The bull had been through this before, the raised voices, the aggressive posturing, the gradual realization that he was about to be taken away from the only place he'd ever felt safe. You planned this, Jake said, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place like bullets sliding into a chamber. You knew who he was when you brought him to that auction. You knew I'd buy him, and you knew you could use this law to get him back. I don't know what you're talking about, Big C said, but his eyes gave him away. I just want to make sure the community's safe. The community's safe from you, you mean? You can't stand the thought that someone might actually care about an animal you've spent years breaking. Big C's false mask of concern slipped, revealing the cruelty underneath. That bull's worth more than you know, boy. Prize bloodline, champion genetics, worth 10 times what you paid for him if he's handled right. So this is about money. Everything's about money, son. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be. After the convoy left, Jake sat in the paddock with Thunder, his back against the fence, staring at the court order until the words became meaningless symbols on paper. The bull had settled beside him, his massive frame providing warmth and comfort in the cool evening air. For a creature who was supposed to be dangerous, Thunder seemed remarkably calm, almost philosophical about his fate. I don't know what to do, Jake admitted to the animal who'd become his closest friend. I can't fight the law, and I can't fight Big C's money. but I can't let you go back to that hell either. Thunder's massive head turned toward Jake, and those intelligent eyes seemed to hold understanding. The bull shifted closer, his shoulder touching Jake's arm, and Jake felt the strength that lived in that enormous body. Not the strength of violence, but the strength of endurance, of surviving things that should have killed him. "You're not afraid, are you?" Jake asked, studying the bull's calm demeanor. "Even knowing what's coming, you're not afraid." Thunder's response was to lay his head across Jake's lap, a gesture of trust so profound that Jake felt tears burning his eyes.
This magnificent creature, this survivor, this fighter, this gentle giant, was teaching him something about courage, about facing the impossible with dignity.
"All right," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "If they want you, they're going to have to take you. But I'm not giving up without a fight." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked out to the paddock at midnight, expecting to find Thunder resting, but instead found the bull standing at the fence, looking toward the road as if sensing danger approaching. The moonlight cast long shadows across the pasture, and Jake could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. 4 generations of Morrison men who'd worked this land, loved this land, and fought to keep it. "You feel it too, don't you?" Jake said, climbing over the fence. "Something's coming." Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound of engines in the distance, still too far away to be certain but growing closer. Jake listened, his heart sinking as he recognized the rumble of multiple vehicles approaching the ranch. Big C wasn't waiting for the 24 hours to expire. He was coming now, under cover of darkness, when there would be no witnesses to whatever happened next. "Son of a bitch," Jake whispered. "They're coming early." The convoy that pulled into Jake's driveway looked like an invasion force. Big C's black pickup led the way, followed by a large livestock trailer, Deputy Morrison's patrol car, and 2 more trucks filled with men Jake didn't recognize. Spotlights blazed to life, turning the peaceful ranch into a war zone, and Jake could hear the sound of equipment being unloaded. Ropes, electric prods, tranquilizer guns. Thunder moved to stand between Jake and the approaching vehicles, his massive frame blocking the harsh lights. Jake could feel the tension in the bull's muscles, could sense the ancient instinct to protect and defend warring with the learned helplessness of years of abuse. "Easy, boy," Jake said, his hand on Thunder's neck. "We're not going to give them a reason to hurt you." Big C climbed out of his truck, flanked by 6 men who looked like they'd been hired for their size rather than their intelligence. "Time's up, Morrison. Plans changed. We're taking the bull now. The court order gives me 24 hours, Jake said, his voice carrying across the yard with the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "It's only been 12. Anonymous tip came in about an hour ago," Deputy Morrison said, his face grim with the weight of duty he didn't want to perform. "Someone reported the bull acting aggressively, charging the fence, threatening passers-by. Public safety takes precedence over court orders." Jake looked at Big C, seeing the satisfaction in the man's eyes. "Anonymous, huh? Let me guess. You wouldn't happen to know who made that call?" "Doesn't matter who reported it," Big C said, his voice carrying the false authority of a man who'd bought his way out of consequences his entire life. "What matters is that animal's a clear and present danger to the community. Boys, get the equipment." The men moved toward the paddock with the efficiency of a military operation, carrying heavy ropes, electric prods, and what looked like tranquilizer guns. Thunder's massive head came up, ears forward, eyes bright with intelligence and growing alarm. Jake could see the bull's muscles tensing, could feel the fear radiating from the animal like heat from a fire. "You're not taking him," Jake said, stepping between the men and the fence. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever." "Jake, please," Deputy Morrison said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You're outnumbered, and you're outgunned." There's no point in getting yourself hurt over an animal. Over an animal? Jake's voice cracked with emotion. This isn't just an animal. This is my family. This is everything my father worked for, everything my grandfather built, everything that matters in this world. Your father's dead, boy, Big C said with casual cruelty. And your grandfather's been dead for 20 years. That bull ain't family. He's livestock. And livestock belongs to whoever can afford to feed it. You're wrong. Jake's voice carried the authority of 4 generations of Morrison blood. You're wrong about everything. Thunder isn't livestock. He's home. And home is where he's going to stay. That's when the miracle happened. Headlights appeared on the county road, growing brighter as they approached the ranch. 1 set, then 2, then half a dozen. Pickup trucks, SUVs, and cars turned into Jake's driveway, their occupants emerging like an army of guardian angels summoned by prayer. Ellie Henderson climbed out of Bobby Ray's truck, her 72-year-old frame carrying the authority of a woman who'd buried 3 husbands and raised 5 children, and still had fight left in her bones. Behind her came Tom Fletcher, the man who'd questioned Jake's sanity just weeks before. Then came the Johnsons from the neighboring ranch, the Martinez family, Dr. Sarah Collins, and a dozen other neighbors Jake hadn't spoken to in months. "Evening, Clarence," Ellie said, her voice sweet as honey and sharp as a razor blade. "Mighty late for a social call, don't you think?" "This is official business, Eleanor," Big C said, his confidence wavering for the first time. "You folks need to move along before someone gets hurt." "Official business?" Tom Fletcher stepped forward, his weathered face hard as granite and twice as unyielding. "Since when is stealing a man's livestock official business?" "That bull's dangerous," Big C insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "He's hurt people before. We're just trying to protect the community." "Funny thing about that," Bobby Ray said, pulling out his phone with the satisfaction of a man who'd done his homework. "I've been making some calls about your dangerous bull. Turns out those 3 men he supposedly hurt, they were drunk off their asses trying to ride him like he was a carnival attraction. Amazing what you can find in old police reports when you actually bother to look." Big C's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "That doesn't change anything. The animal's still a public safety hazard." "Says who?" Dr. Collins stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years treating large animals. "I've been observing that bull for the past 2 weeks, and I've never seen an animal more gentle or intelligent." "If Thunder's dangerous, then so is my grandmother's poodle." Jake felt something shifting in his chest, a loosening of the despair that had been strangling him for months. These people, his neighbors, his community, the folks who'd known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, were standing up for him when he couldn't stand up for himself. "You don't understand," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm losing the ranch anyway. In 2 weeks, the bank's going to foreclose. Thunder can't save that." "Maybe not," Tom Fletcher said, pulling a manila envelope from his truck. "But maybe we can." Jake opened the envelope with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Inside were checks, dozens of them, written by neighbors and friends and people he barely knew. The amounts varied from $50 to $5,000, but each one represented something more precious than money. It represented faith, hope, and the kind of love that only comes from people who've decided you're worth saving. "This is," Jake couldn't find words. "Enough to pay off the bank and give you a fresh start," Ellie said softly. "Your daddy helped every one of us at some point. Seems like it's time to return the favor." "I can't accept this." "You can and you will," Bobby Ray said, his voice carrying the authority of lifelong friendship. "Because that's what family does. And in case you haven't noticed, Jake Morrison, you've got a pretty big family." Big C watched the scene with growing fury, his carefully laid plans crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. "This is all very touching," he snarled, but it doesn't change the fact that I have a legal right to that bull." "Actually," said a new voice from the darkness, "you don't." Everyone turned to see Dr. Victoria Harland approaching, carrying a thick folder of documents, and wearing the kind of determined expression that said she'd spent the night digging through legal records and veterinary reports. Her face was pale but resolute, and Jake could see that she'd been crying. "I've been researching Mr. Williams' claims," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I've found some very interesting information." She handed the folder to Deputy Morrison, who opened it with the careful attention of a man who'd learned that the devil was always in the details. 3 years ago, Clarence Williams was cited for animal cruelty by the State Veterinary Board. Part of his plea agreement was that he could no longer own or purchase livestock without direct state oversight. The sale of Thunder to Jake Morrison was illegal from the start, not because the bull was dangerous, but because Williams had no legal right to sell him. Big C's face went purple with rage. "That's a goddamn lie." "It's public record," Vicky said calmly, pulling out additional documents. "Available to anyone who cares to look, which means Thunder legally belongs to Jake Morrison, and any attempt to remove him constitutes theft." Deputy Morrison studied the documents with growing seriousness, his flashlight playing across legal seals and official signatures. "I'm sorry, Clarence, but if this documentation is accurate, I can't help you. In fact, I might have to arrest you for fraud and attempted theft." The defeat in Big C's eyes was complete and total. He looked around at the circle of determined faces, seeing his own reflection in their contempt, and Jake realized that sometimes justice came not from courts or laws, but from communities that decided enough was enough. "This isn't over, Morrison," Big C said, his voice carrying the impotent rage of a bully who'd finally been stood up to. "Not by a long shot." "Yeah, it is," Jake said, his voice carrying the strength of generations and the support of people who'd chosen to believe in him. "It's over. And you lost." Big C and his men climbed back into their trucks with the bitter taste of defeat poisoning their mouths, their departure marked by squealing tires and a cloud of dust that seemed to carry away all the malice and cruelty they'd brought to the Morrison Ranch. As the convoy disappeared down the county road, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not just relief, but a profound sense of vindication, as if the universe itself had finally decided to balance the scales. The crowd began to disperse slowly, neighbors shaking hands and patting backs, but the warmth of their support lingered in the air like the scent of rain after a long drought. Jake found himself standing in the middle of his own driveway, surrounded by people who'd chosen to believe in him when he couldn't believe in himself, and the weight of their faith was both humbling and terrifying. "Why?" he asked Vicky as she approached, her folder of legal documents clutched against her chest like armor. "Why did you help me after what happened before?" Vicky's eyes filled with tears that caught the moonlight like diamonds. "Because I was wrong, Jake. Wrong about everything. I was so focused on protecting my professional reputation, so scared of what people would think, that I forgot what really matters. When I saw you with Thunder, saw the way you looked at him, saw the way he trusted you." She paused, struggling with words that seemed too small for the emotions they carried. "I realized that I'd never seen anything so pure in my entire life. I thought you were part of Big C's plan. I was scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Scared of being associated with something controversial, scared of risking my practice, scared of being wrong, but fear's a terrible reason to abandon someone you care about." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the knot of betrayal that had been choking him since the day she'd appeared with the sheriff's deputies. "We all make mistakes, Vicky. What matters is what we do when we realize we've made them. I'm so sorry, Jake, for everything, for not believing in you, for not standing up for what was right, for letting my fear make me weak." "You're here now," Jake said, and the simple truth of those words seemed to heal something broken between them. That's what matters. As the last of the vehicles pulled away, Jake found himself alone with Thunder in the paddock, the bull's massive presence a comfort in the aftermath of chaos. Thunder approached slowly, his enormous head lowering to Jake's level, and Jake felt the familiar peace that came from being in the presence of something genuinely good. "We did it," Jake said, scratching behind Thunder's ears. "We actually did it, boy." Thunder's response was to lean into Jake's touch, his massive body relaxing for the first time in days. The tension that had been coiled in his muscles like a spring finally released, and Jake could see the intelligence in those dark eyes. Not just animal intelligence, but something deeper, something that spoke of understanding and gratitude. But even as they stood together in the moonlight, Jake knew that this victory was only the beginning. The checks from his neighbors would save the ranch, but they wouldn't erase the months of grief and self-doubt that had nearly destroyed him. Thunder was safe, but he was still a bull who carried the scars of years of abuse, still an animal who flinched at sudden noises and unexpected movements. The next morning brought a reporter from the county newspaper, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who'd heard about the midnight confrontation and wanted to tell Thunder's story. Jake was reluctant at first. The last thing he needed was more attention. But Vicky convinced him that sharing Thunder's journey might help other animals in similar situations. "People need to know what's possible," Vicky said as they watched Thunder grazing peacefully in the morning sun. "They need to see that broken things can be healed, that love really is stronger than fear." The interview lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it, Jake had told Thunder's story completely. From the bull's birth on the Morrison Ranch to his sale during the family's financial crisis, from his years of abuse at Big C's hands to his triumphant return home. Sarah Chen listened with the kind of attention that spoke of someone who recognized a story worth telling. And when she left, Jake felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden had made it easier to carry. The article appeared in the next week's edition under the headline, "The Bull Who Came Home," and within days, Jake's phone was ringing constantly. People from 3 counties away wanted to visit Thunder, to see the miracle bull who'd defied every expectation and found his way back to the family that had never stopped loving him. Some visitors came out of curiosity, others from genuine interest in animal welfare, but all of them left with something they hadn't expected, a sense of hope. Thunder had become more than just a bull. He'd become a symbol of resilience, of the power of love to overcome even the deepest wounds. Jake started giving tours of the ranch, telling Thunder's story to anyone who would listen. He spoke about the importance of treating animals with dignity and respect, about the bonds that could form between humans and creatures who had every reason to distrust humanity. But mostly, he talked about second chances. For animals, for people, for dreams that seemed too broken to fix. The ranch began to attract other animals in need. Word spread through the farming community about the Morrison Ranch, and soon Jake was receiving calls from veterinarians and animal control officers about creatures that needed homes. A blind horse named Hope arrived first, followed by a 3-legged dog called Tripod and a deaf cat named Silence. Each animal brought its own story of survival and healing, and each one found peace in the sanctuary that Thunder had helped create. But the most profound change was in Jake himself. The months of grief and self-doubt hadn't disappeared overnight, but they'd been replaced by something stronger: purpose. He'd found his calling not in the traditional ranching that had defined his family for generations, but in the gentler art of healing broken things. Vicky had become a constant presence at the ranch, her veterinary practice expanding to include the growing number of animals that people brought to what had unofficially become known as Morrison's Sanctuary. Her relationship with Jake had deepened into something beautiful and lasting, built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect. "You know what I love most about this place?" Vicky said one evening as they watched Thunder and the other animals in the fading light. "It's proof that broken things can be fixed, that love really is stronger than fear." Jake nodded, thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. Dad used to say that the Lord doesn't give us more than we can handle, but sometimes I think He gives us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. Thunder approached the fence, his massive head lowering to accept the scratches and attention that had become part of their evening routine.
His eyes were bright with intelligence and contentment, holding none of the fear and pain that had defined him when Jake first saw him at the auction.
"You saved me, you know," Jake said to the bull who'd become his closest friend. "I was drowning in my own grief, and you gave me something to fight for." Thunder's response was the gentle rumble that had become their private language, a sound of contentment and love that spoke of bonds stronger than blood, deeper than understanding, and more enduring than time itself. The sanctuary continued to grow, attracting volunteers from the community who wanted to help care for the animals that had nowhere else to go. Ellie Henderson became the unofficial coordinator, her decades of experience with hurt creatures proving invaluable in the healing process. Bobby Ray started bringing his own children to help with the daily chores, teaching them the same lessons about compassion and responsibility that had defined Jake's own childhood. Even Tom Fletcher, the neighbor who'd once questioned Jake's sanity, became a regular visitor, his weathered face softening whenever he watched Thunder interact with the children who came to learn about animal care. "That bull's got more sense than most people," he'd say, shaking his head in wonder. "Makes you think about what really matters in life." The financial crisis that had nearly destroyed the Morrison Ranch became a distant memory, replaced by a new kind of prosperity, not the kind measured in dollars and cents, but the kind that came from knowing you were doing work that mattered. The sanctuary operated on donations and volunteer labor, but somehow there was always enough to meet the needs of the animals who found their way to the ranch. Jake had started a nonprofit organization to formalize the sanctuary's mission, and applications for funding had been surprisingly successful. People wanted to support what Thunder represented, the idea that every living thing deserved a chance at happiness, that love could triumph over cruelty, that healing was possible even for the most broken spirits. But the real measure of success wasn't in the growing number of animals, or the increasing media attention, or even the financial stability that had replaced the constant worry about money. It was in the quiet moments when Jake would find Thunder standing in the exact spot where he'd been born 30 years ago, his massive head raised to catch the morning breeze, his eyes holding the peace that came from being exactly where he belonged. The bull who'd been rejected, abandoned, and written off as worthless had become the heart of a community, the center of a family that extended far beyond blood relations and the embodiment of hope itself. He'd taught everyone who met him that the most broken things were often just waiting for someone to see past the scars to the beauty that lived beneath. In the end, Jake realized, that's what family really was. Not the blood that bound you, but the love that chose you again and again, no matter how broken you might be. And in that paddock, under the vast Texas sky, 3 generations of Morrison dreams lived on in the friendship between a man and a bull who'd both learned that home wasn't a place you found, but a place you made, one act of love at a time. 1 year had passed since that midnight confrontation when the community had rallied to save Thunder, and the Morrison Ranch had transformed into something Jake's father never could have imagined. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one broken bull had evolved into a beacon of hope for hundreds of animals and thousands of people who'd found inspiration in Thunder's story. The crisp October morning air carried the scent of hay and wood smoke as Jake stood on the wraparound porch of the new visitor center, watching his 4-year-old nephew Tommy climb carefully onto Thunder's broad back. The massive bull stood perfectly still, his intelligent eyes alert but calm, understanding with the wisdom of a creature who'd learned that strength and gentleness could coexist in the same heart. "Look, Uncle Jake!" Tommy called out, his small hands gripping the special harness Jake had designed for the children who came to visit. "Thunder's teaching me to be brave." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion, remembering his own childhood fears and how his father had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Now, Thunder was passing on that same lesson to a new generation, showing them that healing was possible, that love could triumph over cruelty, that even the most broken spirits could find their way home. The Morrison Ranch Sanctuary now sprawled across 500 acres, purchased with donations from people who'd been moved by Thunder's story. The original ranch house had been expanded to include offices for the nonprofit organization Jake had founded, and a dozen new buildings housed the growing number of animals who'd found refuge there. But the heart of the sanctuary remained the original paddock, where Thunder had first learned to trust again, where broken things came to heal, where miracles happened, one act of kindness at a time. Vicky emerged from the new veterinary clinic they'd built behind the barn, her wedding ring catching the morning light as she waved to Jake. They'd been married 6 months ago in a ceremony held right there in Thunder's paddock, with the bull serving as an unlikely but perfect witness to their vows. The local newspaper had called it the wedding of the century, but for Jake and Vicky, it had simply been the moment when their shared mission became a shared life. "The new horses are settling in beautifully," Vicky announced, settling beside Jake on the porch swing they'd installed 2 summers ago. "That little mare with the injured leg is already following Thunder around like he's her guardian angel." Jake smiled, watching Thunder carefully step over a fallen log while Tommy laughed with delight. The bull's influence on the other animals was remarkable. Horses calmed in his presence, dogs stopped barking when he approached, and even the wildest cats seemed to find peace near his massive, gentle form. He'd become the unofficial therapist of the sanctuary, helping traumatized animals learn to trust again simply by being himself. "Speaking of guardian angels," Vicky continued, "Dr. Chen called this morning. The documentary about Thunder has been accepted to the Sundance Film Festival. They want us to attend the premiere." Jake shook his head in amazement. The documentary, titled The Gentle Giant, had been filmed over the past year, chronicling Thunder's journey from broken victim to healing force. But more than that, it had explored the deeper questions about how society treats its most vulnerable members, both human and animal. The filmmaker, David Chen, had spent months at the ranch, capturing not just Thunder's story, but the stories of all the animals and people who'd found healing there. "Dad would never believe this," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. "A bull born in this paddock is going to be featured at a Hollywood film festival." "Your father would be proud," Vicky said, taking his hand. "He'd be proud of what you've built here, proud of the lives you've saved, proud of the man you've become." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Jake looked up to see a familiar convoy turning into the sanctuary's entrance. Not the threatening black trucks of a year ago, but the colorful array of cars and vans that brought the weekly volunteers. Every Saturday, dozens of people came to help with the sanctuary's work, from local teenagers earning community service hours to retired teachers who'd found new purpose in caring for wounded creatures. Among the volunteers was Eleanor Henderson, now 83 and still sharp as a tack, who'd appointed herself the sanctuary's unofficial historian. She'd been documenting every animal's story, every successful rehabilitation, every adoption into a loving home. Her weekly newsletter had grown into a magazine with subscribers across the country, all of them drawn to the simple message that love could heal even the deepest wounds. "Morning, Jake," Ellie called out, climbing carefully from Bobby Ray's truck. "Ready for another day of miracles?" "Every day's a miracle here," Jake replied, and he meant it. The sanctuary had become a place where the impossible happened regularly, where horses learned to trust again, where dogs forgot their fear, where people discovered that their own broken hearts could be healed by helping others. The morning brought a steady stream of visitors, each group carefully guided through the sanctuary by trained volunteers who told the stories of the animals they met. Thunder was always the star attraction, but he shared the spotlight gracefully with Hope, the blind horse who'd learned to navigate by sound. Tripod, the three-legged dog who could outrun animals with twice as many legs, and Silence, the deaf cat who'd become the sanctuary's unofficial greeter. But it was the children who truly understood Thunder's message. They approached him without fear, saw past his massive size to the gentle soul beneath, and left with a different understanding of what it meant to be strong. Many of them returned week after week, forming bonds with the animals that would last a lifetime. "He's not scary at all," a little girl named Emma told her mother, as Thunder lowered his head to accept her gentle pats. "He's just really big and really nice." "That's right, sweetheart," her mother replied, tears in her eyes. "Sometimes the biggest hearts come in the biggest packages." The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, a delegation from the state legislature who'd heard about the sanctuary's work and wanted to see it for themselves. They came with cameras and notebooks, documenting the programs that had made the Morrison Ranch a model for animal welfare across the country. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable," said Senator Patricia Williams, no relation to the infamous Big C. "You've created something that transcends traditional animal rescue. This is about healing communities, about teaching compassion, about showing that even the most damaged beings can find redemption." Jake gave them the full tour, telling Thunder's story with the passion of a man who'd lived every moment of it. He spoke about the importance of second chances, about the bonds that could form between humans and animals, about the power of love to overcome even the deepest trauma. "The secret," Jake explained as they watched Thunder interact with a group of children, "is that we don't try to fix them. We just give them a safe place to heal themselves. Thunder taught me that. He didn't need me to make him whole. He just needed someone to believe he was worth saving." The legislators took notes, asked questions, and left with a commitment to support legislation that would strengthen animal welfare protections across the state. But more importantly, they left with a deeper understanding of what was possible when communities chose compassion over convenience, love over profit. As the sun began to set over the sanctuary, Jake found himself back in Thunder's paddock, the place where it all began. The bull approached slowly, his massive head lowering to accept the scratches and attention that had become their evening ritual. His eyes were bright with intelligence and contentment, holding none of the fear and pain that had defined him when Jake first saw him at that auction. "You know what you've done, don't you?" Jake said to his oldest friend. "You've changed everything. Not just for me, not just for this ranch, but for everyone who's met you. You've shown them that healing is possible, that love is stronger than fear, that even the most broken things can be made whole again." Thunder's response was the gentle rumble that had become their private language, a sound of contentment and love that spoke of bonds stronger than blood, deeper than understanding, and more enduring than time itself. The sanctuary had grown beyond Jake's wildest dreams, but its mission remained simple: to provide a safe haven for animals in need, and to teach anyone who would listen that every living thing deserved a chance at happiness. Thunder had become more than just a bull. He'd become a symbol of hope, a teacher of compassion, a reminder that the most profound transformations often came from the most unlikely sources. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, he'd been a broken man about to lose everything that mattered to him. Now, he was surrounded by family, not just Vicky and the animals, but a community of people who'd chosen to believe in the power of love to heal, to transform, to make all things new. The ranch that had once been on the verge of foreclosure now welcomed thousands of visitors each year, each one leaving with a deeper understanding of what it meant to care for those who couldn't care for themselves. The animals that had found refuge there became ambassadors for their species, teaching humans about resilience, about forgiveness, about the simple joy of being alive. But perhaps the most important lesson Thunder had taught was that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. One that required patience, faith, and the willingness to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. In a world that often seemed defined by cruelty and indifference, The Morrison Ranch Sanctuary stood as proof that love was not just possible, but powerful, not just hoped for, but real, not just dreamed of, but lived every single day. Thunder had found his way home, and in doing so, he'd shown countless others the way to their own healing. The bull who'd been rejected, abandoned, and written off as worthless had become the heart of a movement, the center of a family, and the embodiment of hope itself. His legacy would live on in every animal saved, every heart healed, every life transformed by the simple but revolutionary idea that love was indeed stronger than fear, that healing was possible for even the most broken spirits, and that home wasn't a place you found, but a place you made, one act of compassion at a time. Friends, as we reach the golden years of our lives, we often find ourselves reflecting on what truly matters. Jake Morrison's story with Thunder reminds us that our greatest victories aren't measured in dollars or accolades, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. Like many of you, Jake faced devastating loss, the death of his father, financial ruin, and the crushing weight of carrying on a family legacy alone. Yet in his darkest hour, when he chose to save a broken bull that nobody else wanted, he discovered something profound. Healing others heals ourselves. Thunder didn't just find his way home. He became home for countless broken spirits who needed to believe that second chances were possible. This story speaks to every parent who's watched their children struggle, every grandparent who's felt forgotten, every person who's wondered if their best days are behind them. The truth is, our most meaningful chapters often begin when we think the story is over. When we choose compassion over convenience, when we extend our hand to lift someone else up, we discover that love multiplies rather than divides. Thunder's legacy lives on because one man decided that broken things were worth saving. What moment in your life taught you that healing others can heal yourself? Have you ever discovered unexpected purpose in your later years that gave your life new meaning? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.